Hi everyone, in this video we're going to go through some of the techniques you can use to change your current drawing from one time of day to a different time of day. So what I'm going to do is essentially take the image we've been working with, and I'm going to use adjustment layers to change this into a nighttime looking scene. So this is essentially the finished artwork. This is a file that I've cleaned up the layers for and organized them all and separated them all out into my different sort of foreground, midground, background layers. Now this is basically so Sean can do a bit of a parallax example for one of the exercises we're including in our sort of week by week activity notes. Keep in mind that an actual parallax animation is not part of your assignment. It's just something that we're showing you how to do. So to give you an idea of sort of what I've been doing is I've just gone through and cleaned up all of my layers. Now on the image I'm going to show you in a second, that still has its original working layers. What I would do once I've finished making my lighting adjustments is I would arrange the layers in that file to resemble these. So when I switch to the next file, you'll notice that I end up with a lot more layers. Now down here in the bottom corner you can actually see the file size, which is about 215 megabytes. Okay, give or take. Alright, and my working file is well over 1.5 gigabytes, so it's really massive. I should also notice or note that this is also a 4K resolution file. What I can do is downscale it to 1080 when I'm ready to go. So let's jump across to the other file. I just thought I'd show you that because that was sort of the starting point, and that's sort of where we left off last time. So in between videos what I've done is I've added in color adjustments to turn this daytime scene into a nighttime scene. So I'm going to show you how I do that, but I'm also going to point out a couple of things. So there's a couple of things here that I haven't finished yet. I haven't applied any color change to the character, so that's going to be one of the things I'm going to do. I haven't applied any color change to this fence over here yet, and the fence shadows need to be adjusted a bit because they're very heavy. So that'll be sort of part of the color adjustment process. I also have this, where we had this highlight on this rear hill, because of the color modifications that I've made to the general environment, the color tones have changed, and what was a highlight is now darker than the object, the hill that it was supposed to be representing a highlight on. So what I'm going to have to do is change the settings for that particular highlight layer so that it actually looks like a highlight again. You can see that on this hill we've got a lighter tone where that highlight is. So, you know, we've got a few additional adjustments to make. But in essence, the process I'm going to show you is how I've pretty much done all the adjustments so far. So you're not really going to be missing anything out by not seeing how I've gotten to this stage. What we're going to do is sort of finish the image off and you'll see the process as we go. You'll also notice that I've changed the artwork for the sun. In essence, what I did was I just, in this file, I deleted the little sun rays and changed the color, and then added some little crater spots on there to turn it into a moon. But the overall shape is actually the original sun shape. Okay, so let's go through and make some adjustments. So the first thing that I really want to tackle is this highlight on this hill at the back, mainly because it's sort of going to be the thing that's probably going to be the most forgettable. If I don't remember to do it now, I'm probably going to forget. So what I want to do is actually create a highlight that's similar to the highlights on the clouds, a similar tone to that. I want a sort of a cool tone to it. So I want to get the highlight area in sort of more of a blue spectrum. and I want to brighten it up. So in essence, I want it to sort of be this color or similar to this color. Now, before I do anything, what I want to do is just double check to see. It's been almost 24 hours since I made this adjustment. So I just want to double check which layers I was using to affect the hill. So I've got my hill group here, and these are all the layers for the hills. Everything that's green is a hill related layer. So you can see it's quite complex in there. Now, you'll notice that on my layers, on a lot of these layers, I've got this hue saturation adjustment layer. These are the layers that change the colors from daytime to nighttime. Okay, so the one that's affecting the hill is this one here. And what I've done essentially is got all of the layers for everything to do with the hills in a group. And then what I've done is clipped the hue saturation layer to that group so that the settings on this hue saturation only affect the hills. Now, what I may need to do technically is perhaps drop this hue saturation down into the folder somewhere in this hierarchy, and then add an additional hue saturation layer just for this particular highlight layer. That is a possibility. So the first thing I'm going to do is just double check that this is actually the layer that's coloring the hills, just to be certain. So if I turn this layer off, you can see that the hills change back to their daylight. So that's definitely my adjustment layer, okay, for the overall hill effect. Now what I need to do is find this highlight layer for this hill, because that's the one that's sort of causing the issues. So I know that my hill front is this hill here, and the two clipping layers above are associated with that particular hill. So that's going to be the noise layer here, and this one I've got selected is going to be the highlight layer just there. If I turn that on and off, you can see that that's the highlight layer. What I might do there is actually just type in high, so I know that that's the highlight layer. I can also see the yellow in there, and I know that that was what I was using for my highlight. So I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to look. So this is the hill front. I'm going to collapse that because we don't really need to worry about that. Hill rear, all of these clipping layers here are associated with the rear hill, which is this one. And I can see that this is the highlight layer because it's labeled high. And if I turn that on and off, you can see that it's turning that highlight on and off. So there's a couple of ways that we can adjust this. We could just directly modify the hue saturation of that layer by selecting it and coming up to Image Adjustments, Hue Saturation, which is Control U. So we could play around with it like that. Potentially we could add an additional adjustment layer directly in here, and essentially adjustment layer gives you all of these adjustment settings, but instead of them directly changing the color of the pixels in the layer, what it does is it places a layer above, which then impacts all the layers below and applies one of these settings. So there's usually an adjustment layer for all of these different types of adjustment effects. Okay, so you can kind of stack multiples and so on. But what that allows you to do is it allows you to use the opacity, for example, or even sometimes a blending mode on the actual adjustment layer itself, so you can get even more effects. So what I could do is a hue saturation adjustment layer specifically for this highlight layer. That's another way of doing it. Or what I could do is add a new layer in, and I could do a selection of this highlight layer and then just add a different color, like this light blue color, over the top as a fill. And I could do it, so I could do it like that. So I've got several options. What I'm going to do is see if I can get a hue saturation to work, a hue saturation adjustment layer, so you can see that process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my highlight layer that I want to affect, and I'm going to come down to the bottom of the layer panel. I've got this little black and white circle. I'm going to click on that, and these are my adjustment layers. What I want to do is use a hue saturation, so I'm going to add that in. Now, because I've added that in sort of in between two clipping layers, it is also clipping, which is what I want. So this now should only affect this highlight layer. So what I'm going to do now is make sure I've got my properties panel open. I usually keep mine down here in the bottom corner. If this isn't open, what you can do is come up to Window and find Properties just here. Right, so these settings work just like doing a normal layer adjustment or an image adjustment, except I can always access the settings very quickly down here. So what I want to do is first off make this more of a blue tone by adjusting the hue slider, and then I also want to adjust the brightness level of it by adjusting the lightness slider. So the first thing I want to do is move the hue to try and get this into more of a blue spectrum. And you can see that that tone is changing the whole hill. So that's going to be an issue that we can fix up in a second. At the moment I'm ignoring the hill and I'm looking only specifically at the highlight region. What I want is more of a blue. Now keep in mind, unless you use the colorize setting, the hue slider, the actual color on the slider where the marker is, does not indicate the actual color. So I'm looking over here at my picture while I'm dialing this back and forth. You'll find that if you use colorize, the marker indicator on the slider will actually indicate whichever color it's on. So that's where that matches up. But without it, it doesn't actually work that way. So what I want is a blue. So it's going to be about here. Something like this. So you can see now that color is similar to what we're seeing on the clouds. And then what I can do is increase the lightness. Like that. And if I want, I can play with the saturation. If I dial the saturation up, I can get like maybe a bit more blue. But depending on the other layers and so on that are blending with it, you may or may not see much of a change. So something like that. Now, here's the issue. This, normally what will happen is a hue saturation adjustment layer or any adjustment layer will affect everything below it, not just the layer that you're clipping in. And because this is part of a stack of clipping masks or clipping layers, it's all kind of filtering down through one another. That's why the color of the hill is changing when I'm changing the slider, even though this is clipping onto this highlight layer. That's then clipping into the rest of the image. So what I want to do is isolate this layer and essentially tell it to only affect the area where the highlight is. And the way I do that is by using the mask that's built into the adjustment layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the control key or the command key on a Mac, and I'm going to click in the thumbnail for the highlight. Like that. So what this is doing now is basically isolating that area, and what I can do is I can now fill that area with black. At the moment the mask is white. I can fill it with black, and what that's going to do is stop the effect of this hue saturation from affecting anything else. Now what I may need to do is actually invert this mask once I've done it. Basically the white area would be the area that would be showing the effect. So if I fill this area with black, because this is already white, the effect is going to be reversed. So by inverting this afterwards, I can then flip it around the right way. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to select my paint bucket tool just here. Or what you can do is use the shortcut, which will be, in this case, it'll be Alt backspace or Option backspace. I've got my black as my color that I'm going to use. And you need to make sure that you click inside the mask so that the little box is around the mask. So I'm going to fill that like that. You can see now I've got the little black line on the mask where I've just filled it. And you can see that the color of that area has reverted back to what it was before. Now what I need to do is deselect the selection and then invert the mask. So I'm going to come up to select, deselect. So that deselects that. And the reason I have to deselect that first is that if I leave that selection there and then invert it, invert the mask, it'll only invert what's in there and it'll just go white again. So if you've got a selection and you invert the layer to reverse the colors, it'll only affect what's inside the selection. So get rid of your selection and it'll invert the whole thing. So make sure I'm on my mask. Oops. I'll just go view properties. All right. Yeah, so select my mask, and what I want to do is go Image, Adjustments, Invert, which is Control or Command I. So when I tap that, it's going to flip the mask around so that the black becomes white and the white becomes black. So the way the mask works is the white area will allow this blending mode to show through in those areas, or the adjustment layer, and the black area will hide the adjustment layer in the black areas. So you can see now what I've got is this light blue highlight rather than that sort of darker kind of reddy purple color. Now once again, what I can do, because this is an adjustment layer, I can play around with the blending mode, and I can also play around with the opacity if I want. So if I dial the opacity down, it's like turning that adjustment off. So if I turn it completely off, you can see that's what we had first, and that's what we've got now. So it looks more like a cool moonlight is hitting that hill. Now I'd want to do the same thing over on this hill so that I'm getting the same color light casting on both. So essentially it would be a similar process for that hill, the other hill. Now what I could do, because this layer, this adjustment layer is already set up for that color, what I could do is duplicate this layer. So I can just copy it by dragging it down to the layer button. And then if I move this up above the highlights of the other hill, like that, what I need to do now is just make sure that the mask is set up for the other highlight on the other hill. So if I just select the mask and I hit Option or Alt backspace, that'll just fill the whole mask in with black. And then if I hold down my Command or Control key and click in the highlight for this hill, like that, and then I fill the mask with white, I now get the color adjustment so it matches on that hill. So you can see how quickly, relatively speaking, once you understand the process, you can go through and actually just flip colors to make it look either like night or day, or, you know, maybe there's a, you know, like a bushfire or whatever the process, or, you know, whatever the lighting conditions you want to set up are. I don't have to repaint anything. It's all about just using adjustment layers to flip the colors around. And so I can make this, you know, this look like any kind of day, and even do things like making it look like it's foggy or very smoky by desaturating all the colors and making them more like gray tones. So it's a really, really flexible, powerful system. So getting to understand clipping layers, clipping them into one another, groups, so that you can isolate layers sort of as individual objects, and adjustment layers so that you can modify those, is a really, really powerful set of skills to have. Okay, so I'm just going to do a couple more just to kind of finish off this image, and I might just add a couple of stars in as well just to complete the night sky. So basically the other things I want to do is the fence and also the emu. I'm going to do the emu now and then work my way back to the fence. I'm going to collapse my hill layer just to hide all of those, and I'm going to hide the moon layer. So try and have as few of these groups open as possible, and that way you can kind of run up and down a little bit more easily. That's why I like to use groups. I can hide a lot of my layers, because sometimes I might end up with, like, you know, 400 layers in a single PSD. and that's going to take a long time to scroll. Okay, so tree. Don't need the tree. Don't need the bush, the grass. The emu's in purple down here, so let's do the emu. So within the emu layer, I've got this group here, and that's the shadow. Okay, so I'm going to rename that one shadow, and that's those layers in here. What I might do is call this lighting, because it's actually got the highlight layer in there as well. So if I collapse that down, actually it doesn't. It looked like it was in there because it's inset because of the clipping setting. So I'm just going to call this shadow. Okay, so you can see there I can turn the shadow on and off. I've got my highlight, and then I've got my actual character art there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a color adjustment for the shadow. So I'm going to select my for the highlight. I'm going to select my highlight layer. I'm going to add in a hue saturation adjustment layer, and then I'm going to do what I did before, which is dial down to a blue. So you can see when the hue saturation is impacting the entire image, and you just dial the hue, you get some really cool kind of psychedelic kind of effects, you know. So it's really, really good if you've never played with the adjustment layers before, or just the general image adjustment settings. Have a go. You can get some absolutely fantastic effects. I think I need to go more this side so that it's a cooler blue. Yep, something like that. And then what we want to do is make sure that we're only dealing with the actual highlight layer. So I'm going to Command or Control click the highlight. So that's the only thing that's going to be changed. And then I'm going to fill my mask. So let's go Alt Backspace. Okay, and so what that's doing, because this this mask isn't inverted yet, it's giving me the flipped result from what I want. The pink clouds look great. I need to deselect, and then I need to invert that layer. So Command or Control I. Okay, now here's a problem. It's not clipping at the moment. You can see that we're getting the scraggly edges, and that's because I've not actually set this up to clip into that layer. So I'm going to hold down Alt and click between, and that then isolates those highlights to only work or only appear anywhere where the highlight layer does. So there we go. So now I've got my blue kind of moonlit highlight for the character. And what I'm going to do is maybe dial them back a little bit, because they are a little bit strong, especially on the legs. So something a bit more like that. Now, one of the things I haven't done is actually done an overall color adjustment on the character itself. So that's something that I could also do. So let's maybe do that. Now, instead of applying it to everything in the emu group, which would include the highlights, it would include the shadows as well. I don't want to really play with those because they're kind of set up the way I want. What I'm going to do is add a blending mode into the layer hierarchy just for the character file itself, or the character layer. So I'm going to select the character layer, add another hue saturation. Once again, that's going to affect the whole image unless you make sure that it's clipping in, which it is, because it was placed between or underneath a layer that's already clipping. So now what I can do is go in and play around with the hue saturation for the character. One of the things you can do sometimes if you want to do like a nighttime scene is desaturate things a little bit. I tend to not want to do that with this image because it's quite cartoony and stylized. So what I can do maybe is just drop the lightness down slightly. And sometimes what I'll do with nighttime is try and push the colors more into a blue. so that it looks a little bit more like a nighttime scene, something like that. I might not make it so dark. And you can see that it is doing things like changing the colour in the hair. I'm not overly worried about that so much. You can see that it's drastically changed the sort of anything that was sort of yellow and red. It's changed a lot, and some of the greens as well. So when I've done that, I can also use the opacity to kind of drop that back a little bit to make it a little bit more subtle. So I'm still bringing back some of that. I'm still bringing back some of the color. So we're not losing all the color entirely, but we are getting a slight cool tinge to those colors. Now you can see that it has really sort of affected that highlight on the leg. So what I could do is jump back up to the other hue saturation for the highlight and kind of play around with that a little bit to kind of bring that blue back. The other thing that I could do is isolate the highlight away from this blending mode, so that this highlight layer up here is only dealing directly with the original color. So to do that, what I can do is control click the highlight layer again, and then what I can do is remove that region from this adjustment. Basically what's happening is this adjustment layer we've just added is toning down the EMU entirely, and then this adjustment layer is then blending over the top of the toned down version, which is then changing the color of the highlight. So if I stop this new saturation layer from affecting that highlighted area, it should then give me the highlight color that I got before. So I'm just going to fill that in there, that selection in with black, and you can see now my highlight color kind of resaturates and pops back up into that lighter blue tone again. So it can be quite complicated because we're dealing with so many layers that are interacting with one another, and they've all got different transparencies and in some cases different blending modes and so on. So it can be quite difficult, and this is why you need to practice with this stuff. And you know, over time you'll get it. The more you try and implement some of this stuff in your work. So just start off with the basics. One or two clipping layers and transparencies and stuff, and as you go forward, you'll be able to start incorporating dozens of them and have them interacting with one another. So that's working quite well. Now there's one thing that I'm going to change. What I don't want to do is have any of the color change affect my character's eyes. Quite often what you'll find is, especially in cartoons, when changes are made to the brightness levels, the one thing they keep the same or consistent is the eyes. So it's almost like your character's eyes glow in the dark. And that's just so when you're doing an animation and all the lights go out and your character's left in the dark, the audience can still see the characters and still understand some of their potential emotional states and so on by the shape their eyes are animating in. So you could tell if a character's angry or happy or sad or whatever the emotional state is, just purely from the shape of the eyes and what the pupils are doing, how they're moving and so on. So the ability to keep the eyes visible at all times in any lighting conditions can be something to take notice of. So what I'm going to do is to isolate the eyes, I'm going to use the magic wand, and currently it's set to sample all layers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select my character layer. I'm going to turn off sample all layers, and that way it's not going to be the selection's not going to get impacted by any semi-transparent layers above. So what I can do is select everything within the eye. So just make sure all of that is selected in there. That's a bit jagged, so I can go back in and clean that up in a second. I've got a few extra I've got a few extra pixels in there. So what I might do is just grab the polygonal lasso tool, and if I hold down Alt, I can remove those extra pixels from the selection. There we go. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to, on the Emu hue saturation, what I'm going to do is fill that area with black on that mask, which brings my eyes basically back up to normal. So the hue saturation, the bluing of the character, the desaturation of the character is not going to affect the eyes at all, because they're essentially being excluded from that hue saturation. There we go. Okay, final one, fence. And then basically we are done. There's the fence. There's the highlight for the fence just there. So I think I'll just do I'll impact all of them, because the highlight currently is also a daylight highlight. So I'm just going to add in a hue saturation to both, or to all of it. So I'm just going to make sure that's clipping in. Okay, that has duplicated for some reason. There we go. That's what I want. So we're only going to be affecting the fence. And what we want to do is just kind of bring it more into a blue spectrum. So you can see it's affecting the wood and the highlight. Just there. And I also might bring the darkness down a little bit. So something like that I think will work okay. Now I also want to play with the shadows. The shadows are ridiculously deep just there. And it's probably because I've got... so the way I've been setting up my shadows, the way I've been setting the shadows up is I've got a layer, which a duplicate of each shadow layer. The first layer essentially is set to normal, and it has its opacity adjusted. The second layer is set to overlay, and then the opacity is set dropped down as well. This one is set to 100, which means it's not getting any kind of transparency to it. So I think I must have dialed it up at some point and made it go solid again. So you can see there what I get is essentially this kind of blending. Now, I think what I've been doing here, I think I've messed this particular shadow up, which is why it wasn't working. Normally what I would do is have the shadow underneath be overlay, and then the shadow on top, the shadow layer on top, be normal but set to a lower opacity. And the reason for that is the overlay basically is going to go semi-transparent but keep the saturation of the color underneath. And then the shadow layer on top is just a solid black with its opacity dropped just to adjust the brightness of it. Now I can also drop the opacity of the overlay layer as well. We can kind of just, dial that down. So something along those lines. I've also got the same issue with the rocks, so I'm going to fix those up. Let's see. Okay, it's these ones here. So it's going to be those. So here are my shadows. So I've got an overlay layer set to 100 and my normal layer set to... so I can dial those down as well. There is another rock over here because that one's separated out. So that's going to be the layer above. And there's my shadow layer. Yeah. So I'll just dial that down. So now basically all my shadows are sort of similar to one another. So we are done. That's basically all of the adjustments. The only other thing that I was going to do is add in some stars. And I've been thinking about sort of the way I would do that, and what I'm thinking is let me see. What I was thinking of essentially was doing kind of like stylistic stars. Sort of a little bit inspired by Steven Universe. They do these little diamonds in clusters. So I was thinking something along like a basic shape. So rather than using diamonds, what I was thinking is using triangles, little triangles. So what I've done here is switched over to the polygon tool and then dialed the sides down from 6 or 5 down to 3. And what that should do is give me some triangles. So I'm just going to add a new layer right up above everything else for the time being. And then what I'll do is I'll move it down into position once I've drawn what I want. So I'm going to make sure I'm drawing in pixels, and I'm going to make sure that my color is white for the foreground color. And the nice thing with this is that I can draw them at different angles like this. So I just get these little triangles. So I mean, we've got an emu here, so this is like an Australian outback thing. So what I might do is sort of like a bit of a Southern Cross type situation. So it looks like we're in sort of Australia somewhere. So something like that. Yeah, something like that. And then what I might do is add in just a few others here and there, just randomly. I might put them in small clusters, so that they're, you know, the idea of clustering them is sort of harkening back to that kind of Steven Universe type idea. And there is one more thing that I'm going to do after. I don't want all of them to be in 3s as well. Let's see what the balance of that's like. Yeah, it's not too bad. I'll probably do another one. Maybe up here. Just got to remember to one of the problems with the Wacom tablet is the nibs on them can be a bit loose, and so sometimes it actually acts like a double click. So I just want a couple of little tiny little ones here and there. So yeah, it really drives me crazy, because it sort of makes it much harder sometimes to... There we go. For ones that are this small, it's actually easier just to go into like the brush tool and just go with like a super tiny brush, you know, like a 1 or 2 pixels, like that, and just, you know, physically draw them in. So something like that, you know. We can put a gradient over that to make them fade down the screen as well. So that would be with a layer mask, okay. And then the other thing I wanted to do is add a glow. So if I double click this layer, it gives me layer style, and I've got this outer glow option just here. So if I click that on, it's going to give me these glow options, okay. So what I'm going to do is increase the opacity up, okay, and I need to also, because I'm working on 4K, it's barely showing up because the size is only 2 pixels, so I'm just going to increase the pixel width as well. And what this is doing is adding this little corona around those stars, just to make them shine a little bit more. You can play around with the blending modes and opacities, like I said, and you know, it's up to you. Okay, that's sort of not too bad. If I wanted, I could also maybe push the color spectrum into blue slightly, just ever so slightly, and that'll sort of tone the glow down a little bit. So I'm going to OK that, and then what I'm going to do is grab my mask, grab my gradient tool just here, make sure I'm on a linear gradient, and what I'm going to do is basically try and blend these down a little bit. So if I've got white in the foreground just here, and if I start at the top, what I want to do is sort of blend these down. I want the ones at the top to remain as they are, but I want these to sort of blend as they go down. So I'm going to start about here and just hold shift and drag down. And so what I get is this slight dimming of the stars lower down. So the you know, closer to the horizon they get, the more sort of dim they'll become, because the sky's a bit lighter at the horizon. Okay, that's it. That's basically the image more or less finished. So if we just hide that and go full screen on it, we can take a look at the image. So there's the completed image. Taking a quick look, more or less everything's in place. So we've made our adjustment layer, adjustments to color to change the time of day using a range of adjustment masks, adjustment layers, particularly hue saturation. And we've controlled those by setting them up as clipping layers so that they're only affecting certain layers underneath, and also by using the layer mask that is activated on all of your adjustment masks to isolate the effect that those adjustment layers are having, and isolating them to only certain parts of the image. So I hope you've been enjoying the assignment that you've been working on, and I hope you've learnt a little bit. You know, hopefully you've learnt something new from running through this assignment, and I'm looking forward to seeing everybody's work. So we'll leave this here, and I will hopefully speak to you all again soon.